Okay, I'm incredibly excited to be here today. I cannot think of a better group to whom to sort of roll out this like very new research. And this is my first external seminar with this research. I do want to say, especially after that like very kind introduction from Grace, I want to warn all the economists in the room, there is nothing causal in this paper. This is a descriptive paper. Sorry. So if you need to leave now, I won't be offended. We've done other causal work with these data, but that is not what we're doing today. What we are doing today, it's very interdisciplinary, and it's very much trying to think in new ways about the inequality in the labor market in our society, and it's the implications of that for federal policy around supporting families. And so this group is perfect. And I should say this is joint work with my co-author Anna Gassman-Pines. And yes, so I do have some slides though that are for the economists. And then what I want to start by thinking about is, okay, so since welfare reform in 1996, low-income parents have faced what we might think of as a dual mandate, the way that the Federal Reserve, right, is supposed to minimize inflation and maximize employment, right? Low-income parents are supposed to continue to be parents, right? They're supposed to care for their children. They need to take them for checkups. They need to stay home with them when they're sick, et cetera. All of those things are ways they need to spend their time. And they also need to work to support them, right? That was the point of welfare reform in the 90s, right? And the largest federal programs to support families with the cost of raising children, right? The EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, and the Child Tax Credit have earnings phase-in. Right, so you don't get them if you're not working, and then this subsidizes work. So the more you earn, the more you get. I'll talk more about that structure later. Cash support since 1996 has had work requirements. You can't get cash, from the government as a direct transfer as a parent, unless you are meeting work requirements. And now there's talk of adding work requirements to the remaining large means-tested programs, the ones that still are sort of safety net programs. SNAP and Medicaid, there's talk about adding work requirements for parents with children to those. And I want to think about that in the context of what work looks like for low-income families today. Okay, so work opportunities have moved toward the service sector, and that's, actually, it's certainly not less so for people with children, right? So basically all services become a dominant employment sector. All of the net job growth since 1959 has been in services. Now, some of that is like financial services and a bunch of other things. I'm going to focus today on individuals who work in a retail, food service, or hospitality occupation. So this is sort of like customer-facing commercial service work, right? And that is itself a really large share of the economy, right? Like 1 in 5 workers work in one of those jobs, and it's slightly higher. It's not lower among those with a minor child. And then for low-income families, right? For low-income workers, it's a third, right? A third work in these jobs. And for those with a minor child, it's 37%. Okay, so this is, almost 2 in 5, low-income parents with a minor child is working in a retail, food service, or hospitality occupation. Okay. The thing about these jobs is that it's hard to get full-time, full-year hours in the service sector. And just from now on, when I say service sector, it is shorthand for that narrower definition of service sector of food service, retail, and hospitality for the rest of the talk. Okay, so this is all continuously employed adults in low-income households, so less than 130% of the federal poverty line, which is basically the cutoff for SNAP and other programs, with a minor child. So 90% of those of folks in these jobs are working at least 80 hours a month, right? So more than 20 hours a week, right? But only 50% are working full-time hours, right? 40 hours a week on average. Okay. Those numbers are much higher in the rest of the economy, right? These are jobs where it's hard to get full. And this is not because they have a minor child, to be clear. It's not like they're working fewer hours in order to balance work and family. This is that they actually are more likely to work each of these numbers of hours than our adults employed in these jobs overall. Make sense? Okay. These jobs are also volatile. So a third of low-income workers with children who work in one of these jobs experience at least 1 month of unemployment across the calendar year of 2022. And again, that's not because people are like leaving these jobs for the summer, things like that, because of their kids, right? That's actually slightly less in these service jobs for workers in households with children as for all workers. Yes? Okay. And low total hours and frequent unemployment are basically, I'm going to argue, and I'm going to sort of develop this for you, they're symptoms of underlying hours volatility. So this is work reproduced from Bauer, East, and Howard in a recent Hamilton Project report. This is mean work hour instability using this statistic called the coefficient of variation, which is basically the standard deviation of average hours worked per month across the course of the calendar year divided by the mean. And you can see that the lowest quintile of the income distribution has much, much higher hours instability across, like monthly hours instability across the course of the year than do folks at the other levels, right? So what's happening is that the reason they have these sort of low average hours is because they have these volatile hours. Does that make sense? They're not working sort of consistent high hours. Okay. Now, this is the point in the talk where a lot of times people say, okay, but how do we know that that's because that's what they want, right? They're sort of custom tuning this to whatever, both the people with and without kids, right, are living these flexible lives. How do we know that volatility is not flexibility? Yes? Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of quotes. I told you, economists, this is a little bit wild. We did talk to people. And then I'm going to give you some statistics. So just buckle up. It's okay. Okay, so this is a Gap employee saying, I was working at the Gap, and it was like, sometime we had business and sometime we didn't. So, working at retail, you get hours off of the money that the company makes, or their goals that they make, or whatever the case may be. So it's like sometimes if we didn't make our goal, we barely had hours. And I'm going to unpack that for you in a minute. This is a person who works as a server at a beloved Philadelphia restaurant. If I gave you any more details about the restaurant, those of you who lived in Philadelphia would be like, oh, I know that restaurant. Everyone loves it. Okay. And this worker explains, in terms of like how scheduling works, how many hours you get. It's just sort of like reliant on so many different variables, the weather, the sports events. Okay, so remember, this is Philly. Yes, they do love their sports. Like when the sports teams are doing great, the restaurant that I work at is slow. Like we're not a sports bar, so we don't get that energy. So I mean, it's very temperamental, right? So that's how people are sort of talking about the hours that they get. This volatility is sort of coming from the employer side. And I think Susan Lambert and co-authors, particularly in this management science paper from 2022, but also in a whole body of work that Susan has developed over the years, sort of describe what these employer practices are, right? So the thing is, like, especially if you think about corporations, right? Store managers, like individual store managers, they're pretty low-level employees, right? And they get very little training for how to manage a store. They're tasked with minimizing the wage bill, right? And then they are often incentivized, and this is what the Gap worker was speaking to, they're incentivized based on last month's store performance, right? So if you didn't have a lot of sales last month, this month your sort of wage allowance is going to be low, right? And then also sometimes, they're just given new goals based on higher management discretion, like here's what you need to aim for this month, et cetera. And they're tasked with setting the schedule, managing, these requirements from above that can be changing while sort of trying to keep the store staffed, right? And keep their employees happy, et cetera, to the extent that they can. But you can imagine when you're deciding between your corporate boss and these employees who, and there's a trade-off about who you make happy. And then they also, their job is complicated in other ways because they need to deal with this fluctuating customer demand, right? So they've got weather, they've got demands, they've got whether there's going to be demand based on, what other entertainment is in town, things like that. Then they've got stuff like, inventory delivery that shows up late, right? So like they scheduled people to work inventory, then they need to take those people off the schedule because the inventory didn't come, and they need to schedule those same people for later when the inventory did come, et cetera. So they've got to deal with employees who quit, employees who, you know, call in sick or just don't show up, et cetera. It's a complicated job that they don't get a lot of training for. And in addition, you know, some use schedules as disciplinary tools, right? So, you know, if you don't like someone's attitude, you might give them fewer hours. If they didn't show up, you might give them fewer hours. Or you could think of that not as a disciplinary tool, but just as sort of a logical outcome. You know, if someone has been taking a lot of shifts, you might reward them, right, by giving them more shifts. And it might be more, it seems like that they really like to, you know, are excited about working and want to show up. You're going to assign shifts to them, right? But the other thing to understand, these are sort of logical aspects of their job. You know, I think a lot of economists tend to believe, you know, everybody is optimizing all the time, but the management science literature is actually quite clear that managers like constantly make mistakes and leave, you know, money on the table. And Lambert did this intervention actually, ironically, with the gap, because we just saw that quote about how volatile things are at the gap. That's actually post Susan's intervention, which was an intervention to help the gap stabilize worker hours. And it was a randomized trial, and they found that after this intervention, employees, you know, employee turnover went down, and store sales went up significantly. And so it was a really good idea to stabilize these hours. And the Gap, you know, in principle, rolled this policy out to all its stores because the evidence from the experiment was so convincing. And that worker was talking about her experiences after that policy was implemented, right? So managers just don't necessarily implement the vision. And the example that I love that Susan gives is when they went to help the managers stabilize worker schedules, the first thing they did was they said, okay, show me how you make the schedule for the week. And the managers would open their schedule software, and the schedule software would present them with a blank schedule for the week. And they would just sort of start filling it in with like ideas and like try to like sort of spread things out and whatnot. And a big part of their intervention was to say, hey, so what you could do is instead of starting with a blank schedule, you could copy over last week's schedule and work from there. And that was it. That was an innovation, right? So you can see where some schedule volatility is coming from if people are starting from scratch every week because, you know, they're not highly trained people who are necessarily optimizing. Does that make sense? Okay. So 2/3 of all low-income workers report that their volatility is primarily due to their employer, right? This is not due to something that they're picking. And when we asked, and I'm going to talk more in a minute about the sample that we collected, but later on in a period when there was some schedule regulation going on, you know, minor schedule regulation, we did a survey where we asked service workers whether they would face retribution for facing a particular form of scheduling that under this later regulation, they actually had the right to refuse under local law, which is a type of scheduling called a clopening, where you're scheduled with less than 8 hours between shifts. So like you work until close at midnight, and then you're scheduled again at 6 a.m. the next day. So these fair work week laws that some places have implemented say, you know, give workers the right to refuse without retribution clopenings. And in fact, 60% of service workers told us that they would face retribution for refusing a scheduled assignment like that at a time when it was actually illegal for them to face retribution for that. But to be clear, for the most part, workers, including under these fair work week laws, workers do not have the right to refuse schedules or to refuse schedule changes like that. You know, this type of employment, if you don't take the schedule you're given, you know, that's cause for firing. Okay. So we're going to try to document this level of volatility, right? This type of volatility in a way that's not available in national data sets. So what I've shown you so far comes from the SIP or the SHED. It's relying on reports of average hours across the month. So at the month level, they say, how many hours per week on average did you work this month, right? That's the best national data that's available. But we think that within month volatility is actually where a lot more action is, right? Service workers don't generally work fixed shifts. They work variable days and hours, and parents need to arrange childcare, right? On specific days and hours. Yes, that's everybody. You don't have to have a kid to know that, right? Okay, fantastic. They need to buy groceries weekly, right? So they need to hit some like weekly earning targets, and they need to make sure that they have enough money left over at the end of the month to pay rent, right? So this within month volatility is consequential. But no existing data sets would allow us to capture that. We needed a panel of families in such jobs who could basically report their experiences daily. Okay. Because daily is the time scale at which both the causes and the consequences of this instability occur. Does that make sense? Okay. So the strategy we used, I like to think of it, maybe this is a little highfalutin, as a combination of strategies. So we're sort of working from Eden and Lane, right? This idea of like, we're actually going to go to these families and figure out how they're doing this thing that seems pretty difficult, that it's not sort of transparent how it's actually working. But Eden and Lane, used a convenience sample, right? We're not going to do that. We're going to use the Card and Kruger, basically, approach of we don't have a roster from which to sample low-income service workers with children, but we do have a roster of businesses. And so we're going to recruit people randomly in businesses and build up a representative sample that way in a technique called venue time sampling. That is the standard, it's the top of the line for hard to find populations. Okay. And then it meets Gassman Pines, who's my co-author, because ever since her dissertation work, she has been working on these daily diary studies with families back in the day, because somehow we got old. I don't know how that happened. These were on paper, and she had a whole system for like having them timestamp them, so we knew they did them every day. But now this is all done via text. Okay, and so we're going to be getting daily diaries from them. We recruited people. Right, so we were recruiting hourly service workers with young children. And we did this in the city of Philadelphia for reasons that turned out not to matter, but were important at the time. We had a whole different study design that was a Card and Kruger style diff and diff design with an incoming regulation that got destroyed by the pandemic. It didn't actually get implemented. We've pivoted and used the data for other things. But Philadelphia is a large, relatively typical city. And the Earth Institute at Columbia used to be funded to provide this service for population researchers until we lost our Pop Center grant a little bit ago. And so they provided us with a list of all businesses in retail, food service, and hotels in Philadelphia, and they mapped all of the businesses. Right. So this is the city of Philadelphia. These are different neighborhoods with their like centroids marked. And what we did was we subdivided the city into these smaller areas with a walking route. And those blue points are all the service businesses in that little neighborhood of the city. And then each day we assign to our recruiting teams a walking route with a randomly seated start business within this. And then we told them to either go clockwise or counterclockwise through all of the businesses. Yes, we did this recruiting over August to October of 2019. We visited every service business in the city. And then when we went, we talked to any available service worker who was there, right? And to assess their eligibility. The eligibility we used was, do you have care of a child between the ages of 2 and 7? And that was actually for like another part of the project about like that developmental stage. But a nice thing about kids aged 2 to 7 conceptually here is they're a group of kids who, they definitely need to have their care arranged at all times, right? They're not like super young kids whose parents might not be expected to work that much, right? But they are kids who need, they can't be like left home alone or, expected to get to school by themselves, et cetera. Yes, okay. We talked to 12,000 service workers. 1,766 of them were eligible, which is about right. That's about, from national data, how many we think have care of a child between these ages. And of them, we recruited 2/3 into the study, right? So 1,181 workers. Okay. And then every day we texted them. We did this via basic SMS text message. Everybody had a cell phone.
you can't have one of these types of jobs and not have a cell phone because they text you about, your schedule and stuff like that. Not everybody had a smartphone, but these are basic messages, not the fancy messages. Although this is what it looks like on an iPhone, right? We did daily surveys 3 times. We're only going to focus today on the pre-period, right? The 30 days in fall of 2019, all of which occurs before the pandemic. Okay. And then the key questions that we asked in terms of today's work are, did you work today? Were you supposed to work today? And were the hours that you worked today the hours you were originally scheduled? And if not, what hours were you originally scheduled to work? And then we also asked, who initiated the change in the schedule, et cetera. Questions so far? I've had no questions so far. Is that right? Oh, great. Yep. So we talked to 12,000 people. We recruited the right share, right? In terms of what we expected, but absolutely. I mean that's true for every study. Actually, presumably some more relevant. Sorry, we talked to this share of people who identified themselves as eligible. Yeah. To be clear, this is actually a better recruitment rate than like the government gets. So any study that you ever use, like we're just being transparent about it, but every study you've ever seen had people who refused, right? So absolutely, survey data is not administrative data. There is no administrative data, right, for this, but all of the caveats of survey data that I hope everybody here learned in some sort of class, right? Like just because like you download it from the census or whatever doesn't mean that those problems don't exist for literally every single survey in the world. You can't make people talk to you. Yeah. And it's quite possible that the people who don't talk to you are different from the people who do. Okay. Okay. Other questions? Okay. So for today, we're going to focus on scheduled and unscheduled volatility. Yes, I'm happy to talk, and I have one-on-one meetings with, I think, a lot of you. I'm happy to talk about like the other things we've done with these data and other ways of looking at this question besides these data. But this is what we're going to talk about today. And in particular, we're going to try to develop this notion of holding open time. And I'm going to sort of build up your intuition for that. How much time must hourly service workers with their children hold open for their jobs, right? So, and volatility in work hours is what is going to expand the amount of time that people have to hold open for their job relative to how much they actually work. And the hours that you hold open, that you need to hold open, is what's going to determine your need for childcare, right? Your daily routine and schedule, et cetera. And so we want to have a good measure of what people need to do in order to be available for work. And then we also want to measure how much they actually work and get paid for. And an important thing, in addition to the fact that what you get paid for is the money you have to live on, is that actual earnings is what determines your eligibility for government supports, right? Not your labor supply, but how much of your labor your employer ends up actually buying. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot of variation, right? Some people have their kids in, up to age 7, right? They've got kids in school, or they've got kids in free childcare, Head Start, public pre-K, et cetera. A lot of people have informal care. A lot of people are paying for care. A lot of people are using multiple of those. We do have data on it. Yeah, I'm not going to show you any of that data right now, but we have it for everybody. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So the first thing that's important to understand is that these schedules, people don't get notified of them very far in advance, right? And in terms of like sort of people like maybe this is flexibility, 0.7% of these folks make their own schedule, right? And 3.8% have a set schedule that they work every week. 13% get more than 2 weeks notice, which is what these Fair Workweek Acts tend to mandate in the places that have adopted them, is you have to tell someone, 14 days in advance at least 14 days in advance. So like if the work week starts on Sunday and there's a, Sunday to Saturday schedule, then, if it starts on the 15th of the month, then on the 1st of the month, you need to be told what the schedule is, right? But in the absence of a rule like that, 13% of people are getting schedules that far in advance. And then, the modal thing is to get 1 to 2 weeks notice. And you have to sort of think about like what that means in the sense that you generally get like a week schedule at a time. So it's going to mean like you get told Sunday for the week that starts the next Sunday. So the week that starts the 8th, you would get told on the 1st, right? And so you're getting a week's worth of notice for Sunday and more than a week's notice for the rest of the week. Does that make sense? Okay. And then 31% are getting less than 1 week of notice or report, like it varies, right? So for example, someone might say Sunday prior to Monday's work week, right? So you're getting 1 day advance notice for Monday's schedule and 6 days advance notice for Saturday's schedule. And people also say things like a few days, sometimes 1 day. Some people say like, I just get told the day before whether to show up. You can think of that as sort of like a day laborer type model, right? Except these are employees. Okay, does that make sense? When I worked waiting tables, we got told usually like Thursday or Friday about the next week's schedule that started on Monday, right? So I would fall into this sort of 1 week, right? Yeah.
The right time to ask. I would curious, how much of this variability is inherent in nature of the system, the actual demand from customers is truly variable with unpredictable some time frame like this, or just because there's
Yeah, so let me give you a couple answers to that, none of which are like perfect. One is that when municipalities, and there's also been one state that has adopted a stable scheduling law with 14 days advance notice, comes in, employment doesn't go down in these industries and hours don't go down in these industries, right? Instability does go down in these industries. And in particular, hours also get concentrated more on particular days so that you're working sort of longer shifts per day, fewer days per week, is something that we saw in an evaluation we did of a law like this in Emeryville, California. And that is also what was found in the gap, right? When they tried to implement this with changes in practices, and that's what we see in Emeryville is that people are implementing a lot of the practices, right? And I should say in these, there's no additional like firms going out of business or things like that we see in any of those data. Also that other people have found when they, there's been a different group using a different methodology who's evaluated laws in Seattle and a bunch of other places. There's this SHIFT project at Harvard, Danny Schneider and Kristen Harknett. So some of it seems to be reducible, right? The other thing that those fair work week laws generally do is if they change your schedule at the last minute, and that's how they incentivize employers to actually follow these rules. If they change it with less than 14 days notice, then they basically have to pay you half time for the hours that are canceled and pay you overtime for the hours that are added. So there's an incentive to reduce the instability. And they do seem to respond to that by reducing it, but it doesn't seem to harm their business as much. Quite possibly because it reduces turnover, makes employees more productive, et cetera. You could ask, why don't they do that voluntarily? It's a question I have asked. They don't. The Chamber of Commerce in these places always fights these laws really, really hard, which you would think if they increase profits that they would not fight that. The other thing to say is that other countries generally don't have jobs that work like this. You're mostly not allowed to put people on what are called 0 hours contracts, right? And those countries have different structural unemployment and things like that. So you can think, our labor market might look different, right? If we didn't allow this to work this way, but it's not like these types of jobs don't exist in those countries.
I think that last piece, that all makes sense. The last piece seems kind of critical. But what's common about the jobs, they're all for customer facing.
Absolutely.
So, you can imagine that apparently makes you variable.
Yeah.
But they're for cross country.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, the weather and the sports and all those things,
happen in other countries too. And I mean, I think it is a challenge, you know, but it's a matter of sort of how much volatility the business takes on to itself versus how much it puts on workers. And of course, we think of businesses as economists think of businesses as entities that are sort of designed to be able to take on more risk than individuals do. That's in fact one of the arguments for like the existence of firms. But of course, they're always interested in transferring volatility, you know, when they can, right? Okay, is that? Okay. All right, so I want to build up your intuition about what these schedules look like. So this respondent, so you may recognize this is a Google Calendar. So this is 4 weeks of Google Calendar that we built for this employee. She didn't send us Google Calendar. We took what she told us and made it into a Google Calendar, because I don't know about you, but my life is run by Google Calendar. So this is easier for me to interpret. Okay, so she works at, we have to sort of vaguely describe it, but a hipster bakery chain, local chain in Philadelphia. And she works, the first week she works 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. on Sunday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. The second week of the month, this is September of 2019. She works 6 to 2 on Sunday, 6 to 2 on Wednesday, and then 9 to 5 on Thursday through Saturday. Yes, the next week, 6 to 2 Sunday through Wednesday, 9 to 5 on Thursday. And the fourth week, 6 to 2 on Monday and Wednesday, and Friday and Saturday, 9 to 5 on Thursday. And then she's also held late this last Saturday from 2. She's supposed to work 6 to 2. She ends up working 6 to 4. Make sense? She actually has one of like the most desirable schedules of anyone in our sample. She works actually pretty much guaranteed 40 hours a week. And these are pretty predictable windows, right? There's really just two windows. She has less last minute changes than average. The average person has 1 canceled shift and 2 other types of hours changes over the course of the month. So she's got less. This next person works, doesn't actually work at Old Navy, but works at a place like Old Navy, a similar large chain retail store. And it has more going on, right? 12 to 7, 12 to 9:30, some long shifts, 2:30 to 9:30, 10 a.m. to 6:30, et cetera, right? 2:30 to 9:30 for 3 days. And then these 2 shifts canceled. The next week, also those 2 shifts canceled. In this case, that's actually an employee side cancellation. This is a person whose Friday and Saturday childcare sometimes falls through, right? And what I'm going to show you, that's not really going to matter because I'm not actually going to particularly analyze cancellations versus what's originally scheduled. But about half of the hours changes are due to the employee and about half of the hour changes are due to the employer. I think of that because we're sort of requiring people to meet this dual mandate as sort of, these are both components of volatility that the parent doesn't have control over. I'm very happy to talk to people offline about the best way to sort of decompose volatility into these different, into scheduled volatility, employee initiated and employer initiated, and the best way to think about that. I'm not going to do that for you today, but what I am going to say is the vast majority of volatility is actually in these scheduled hours, not in the cancellations, even though we can show you cancellations, added hours, et cetera, which are sort of random and unexpected when they occur, are very hard on families and their functioning and well-being. Okay. Yes. Some people do hold multiple jobs. I am going to talk about that later. All of this data is going to be for what's called job 1, which is the job we recruit them at, but they work up to 3 jobs. And we do analyze, collect data and analyze data for all 3 jobs. Very few people work 3 jobs, and I'm actually going to talk about why we think very few people even work 2 jobs. But I'm going to show you that, but not for a while. Thank you for foreshadowing. Okay. Is this making sense to people? Okay. And then we have respondent 3. Respondent 3 works at a pizzeria. Interestingly, because I wouldn't necessarily think of a pizzeria as a 9 to 5 job, but this person basically, when they work 9 to 5. This shift, they weren't scheduled to work. That's what we call a surprise shift. And they actually took it on for a coworker. Coworker asked them to take it, and they did. So we have a small share, about 10% of changes that are initiated by coworkers, right? So they ended up working 5 days, 9 to 5 of that week.
The next week, they were scheduled 6 days and worked them all. The next week is the first week of September. That's Labor Day week. And their small business closed for the week. The employer went on vacation. And so they worked, oh, sorry. This one was their employer initiated. This one, they weren't scheduled to work at all this week, but they ended up filling in for a coworker before the vacation started. Okay, then the next week when it reopened, they were originally scheduled to work 9 to 5, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday. Their employer canceled both of those shifts, but asked them to come in 9 to 12 on Monday and 9 to 1 on Thursday, and also 8 to 5 on Saturday, and they picked up all those shifts. Make sense? Okay. All right. Why did this stop? It stopped. That's working. Oh, it's because an update is available for me. That's the problem. No, thank you. Okay, let's see.
The actual power.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Amazing. Okay. Yeah.
So going back to these hours, do you see, I'm assuming that you have a lot more volatility for like these small business owners.
So that's actually not true. Yeah. So when we've looked, they sort of have equal amounts of volatility, right? You might think that the corporate stores do a better job of managing this, but in fact, in Philadelphia, we find it's pretty equal. In Emeryville, we actually found more volatility among the corporate stores than among the small businesses. Possibly because more of the small businesses like still do their scheduling on like in sort of a human way, right? Just like pen and paper where they do sort of take last week's schedule because that would be the easiest thing to do, or because they sort of, you know the workers better, or because small business owners have more human capital around these issues than, does a low level, store manager at the Gap, right? But we don't know the answer to why, but we do know that the volatility is not different in Philadelphia. Okay, so this hour is held open. Here's how I want you to think about it. Yeah.
You have a lot of questions about like schedule. Do you have like a sense of how much they that schedule they have over the week? Like maybe that probably that person they're gonna have the bio that they like build that into like, okay, this is my week off. I get to use. That's not ideal, but maybe they don't.
Yeah, no, so the answer is no. We didn't ask them that. We do ask them about their daily mood and family functioning. So we could look sort of descriptively, because as you say, like people anticipate and we don't actually know how much they anticipate some of these things. Like in this case we do, but we could look descriptively at like how people's moods are in the weeks when they don't work versus do. If that's a good idea, and it could maybe get at your question a little bit. Perfect. Thank you. I'm not writing things down because this is being recorded, so that just seemed easier. Okay, but I am taking your questions very seriously. Okay, so we arrange our time, I'm going to argue, by day of the week, like when we actually think about our lives, all of us. So for example, if you are a faculty member, perhaps on Mondays you teach class 10:10 to 11:25 a.m. and then 1 out of 4 weeks, and then somebody is going to tell me like our department has meetings every week. Okay, maybe 1 out of 4 weeks you have a faculty meeting at 4:10 p.m. Yes, something like that. So when you think about like on Mondays, right, you would not want to schedule like a yoga class or volunteer for like your kids' field trip in a way that like conflicted with his time, because that this is time held open for work. You might be able to schedule something in that 4:10 slot on a week that you don't have a faculty meeting. But on the other hand, it may very well be the case for many of you that your chair or dean would say like, oh, well, we need to have another hiring meeting, and I'm going to schedule it in that 4:10 slot on a week that we don't have the meeting because I know none of you teach during our faculty meeting slot, something like that, right? So you might need to hold that open for longer. You might figure, if they haven't told you that a week in advance, that now it's free, et cetera. Make sense? Okay, so we can sort of think about this a little bit in our own lives. Similarly, for people working in the service sector, an employer has a claim on their time by the day of the week, right? Like your chair having a claim on your time on Mondays, 4:10 to 5 p.m., depending on your chair, you may actually need to hold up until 6 p.m., depending on how they run their meetings, right? It might be scheduled for an hour. It might go longer. You don't know. You know your chair. You know whether you need to actually have someone available to do pickup at 5:30 on those days or not, right? Okay. So for these folks, right, on any given day of the week, during times when their employer might schedule someone, that person is going to need to arrange childcare, right? Even if they have free childcare or school, they're going to need to arrange pickup or drop off if it conflicts with those times. They're not going to be able to take a class to further their education and like get into a different industry. They're not going to be able to schedule a doctor's appointment that you have to schedule 3 months out, and they're not going to be able to work another job that would also have a claim on that time, as you were asking. Does that make sense? Right? So they sort of need to hold this time open. Now for childcare, right, you might have paid childcare like in a center where you have to pay for that time regardless of whether you work it or not. You might have more informal childcare where you only have to pay for it when you use it, and you sort of let your provider know when you're going to work at the same time that you find out when you're going to work. That first person who worked at the hipster bakery, her sister was who she lived with was watching her kid. You can think of that basically as like hot potato of volatility, right? So you're getting the childcare and you're now sort of inducing volatility in this other person's system. That was a really good arrangement though for that particular mom. Later, that arrangement fell apart, and she and her daughter went through like a really hard time for a couple of years until her kid was old enough to go to school. And then she talked about how much her life changed once she was able to have her kid in school. Okay, so this is her, right? So her deal is she needs to hold like every Sunday through Wednesday. If she works 6 to 2. Yes. Now, it may be that if we had more than 4 weeks, we might observe hours outside of this, but our best guess is we're going to say she needs to hold open 6 to 2, Sunday through Wednesday. The only day of the week when she actually always works all the hours she holds open is Wednesday. That's her like guaranteed day, right? And then Thursday and Friday and Saturday, she's working generally 8-hour shifts, but they could be 6 to 2 or they could be 9 to 5. And so she needs to actually hold open 6 to 5. Does that make sense? Okay. So like I said, she's one of like top end of our workers in terms of how predictable her schedule is. She's working full-time hours, 40 hours a week, but she needs to live her life as though she's working 7 days a week, right? And 3 of those days she needs to work as, live as if like basically she works 11-hour shifts, right? So she's holding open 65 hours a week in order to get her 40 hours. Does that make sense? Okay, and that's sort of our notion of hours held open. Respondent 2, these vary more, right? So 11 to 8, sorry, 2 to 9:30, etc. Okay, but this makes sense. And then this person, remember, it's 9 to 5, pretty much whenever he does work, except that one time he works on Saturday, he actually ended up working 8 to 5 when he picked up that shift. Yes.
So you're kind of assuming in this measure that the times where they're not working, they still have to be holding this time open, because I mean, my sense is that service worker job is probably going to be pretty different than like an academic job where you have like this is locked on, like that makes sense to me, but
yeah,
it's also because the job is probably much more fulfilled on nature, like how do we know that they're actually?
So if they don't block off this time, they're not going to be able to work for many hours, right? Does that make sense? Like the way they're getting to the hours that they get to is because they take shifts for the most part when they're offered. Like what I'm going to argue, like the way our jobs work, we actually work a lot more hours than we hold open, right? Like we only have very few hours of the week that are spoken for that we can't do other things. For the most part, we can like, do whatever we want, whenever we want, right? And get our work done how we want. So we have a few hours that are spoken for, and then we do our work whenever we want to. They have the opposite thing, right? They have a bunch of hours that they can't commit to doing anything else, so that they can be available, right? And I'm going to show you some suggestive evidence that they're doing that. Now, it's absolutely true. If you get your schedule, once you get your schedule, right, then you can schedule other things. Remember, though, if they give you a surprise shift,
or hold you late or ask you to come in early, those are fireable offenses if you don't do it, right? And even if you don't get fired, even if you don't have someone, a boss who's gonna be upset that you say like, no, I'm sorry, I don't have childcare, you're missing out on that income. A big difference for us, if we miss a meeting, they don't actually dock our pay, right? But these people, they are poor, so they don't have enough money, right? And so they are incentivized to want to work when a shift comes up. Does that make sense? Yeah. So to some extent, like, yes, they might, as soon as they get their schedule other things, but if they think there's a possibility that they might be called into work at the last minute, they may very well try to hold that time open anyway. If they have to pay for set childcare, they don't get to cancel that, right? You can't suddenly swap in like a college class, right? Because you find out that that week you're not scheduled, right? So there's like a bunch of types of stuff that they could do with their time that they're not able to do. Does that, even once, a few days, a week, 2 weeks in advance, they find out they're not actually working that day. So that's the sense of held open. Maybe the best way to think about it, and I'm very open to, this is new ways to think about this, is something more akin to like commuting or things like that, where we sort of call it like, it's not leisure and it's not work, right? It's some in the middle thing, right? Where this, it's not as costly as actually working, possibly, right? But it's not as free as unscheduled time either. Yeah.
The text data gathering.
Yeah.
Do you have any way to tell whether they were offered a last shift that turned it down because of childcare, or they offered a last shift that turned it down because they had a doctor's appointment or something like that? I think that would.
We did not ask if we ever do this again, although I'm going to show you all the funding we had to do this, and but in some world where we get to do this again, there's a ton of questions that I would love to ask, and that is very high among them. Yeah. Okay. Yes. So when you say they prioritize childcare, what do you mean? So this is this question sort of turning down shifts. Yeah, and so that's what we don't have data on whether they turned down a shift that they were offered. But I will say that from other data and what we know about these jobs, if you turn down shifts very often, you're either going to get officially fired or you're going to get sort of quiet fired, in that they're not going to schedule you, right? And you're not going to be making money. Yes. So I spoke to this a little bit earlier, right, about we know that some kids are in school, some kids are in free like pre-K or Head Start, some kids are in paid centers, and some kids are being watched informally, right? And many people are using multiple of those arrangements.
I can only work hours.
Yeah, so we don't see people being scheduled across all of the hours that these firms are open, right? So there is at least some, customization going on. This is all going to be measured, their volatility within sort of what they, consistently provide, right? Like if we see you working at those times. Does that make sense? But yes, we do know that, and many managers do try to accommodate that, right? But we also see that the majority of our people work 7 days a week across the course of the month. So there's no day of the week. For the majority of our people, there is no day of the week that they consistently have off. So if you imagine something that would seem very reasonable, if you're thinking about saying to your manager, I can only work Monday through Friday, right? Or, I need to have Tuesdays off, because that's when my kid goes to occupational therapy or something like that, right? We're not seeing that as something that it's plausible that the majority of our people have arrangements for. Is that helpful? Okay.
Okay. So what we're going to do, as you can see from those sort of red lines that we drew for each day, is we're going to, for each day of the week across the month of data collection, we're going to identify workday's earliest start time and latest stop time. And for some people, we do have also like multiple segments. And like we don't do the span. We count those as 2 separate segments of the day. And then we're going to include time that's scheduled but not worked. So the start and stop times of shifts that are canceled. And then we're going to also include time, of course, that is worked but not scheduled, right? And we're going to calculate the total hours ever worked or scheduled for each day of the week. And then we're going to sum across all days to get the hours that they hold open each week. So on average, people are holding open around 60 hours per week, right? The vast majority are holding open at least 30 hours a week. And 2/3 are holding open 50 hours or more. Almost half are obviously doing more than 60, because that's what a median is. In terms of hours worked, it's basically about half, right? So I showed you that bakery worker, and I said she was one of our like luckiest people because she's getting 40 hours out of only holding open 65. Most people who work 40 hours are holding open 80, right? And so the median for hours you actually get paid for is 30. Less than 1 in 5 workers is managed to actually work 40 hours a week, and very few people are working a lot more than that.
This isn't not like, oh, for all 4 weeks.
This is the average across the course of the month. So the average hours worked per week across the course of the month.
Can you give a sense of what you think they're doing those held hours that are then also counting scheduled for work? So what I think in the answer to the other question, probably not doing is taking college classes, volatility, probably not scheduling ahead, doctor's appointments or things like that.
Yeah.
But are they grocery shopping? Are there other things that they're taking? Like what are
Almost certainly. Yeah, it seems unlikely that they are. I mean, they're busy parents, right? They're almost certainly not, like sitting in a chair staring at a wall, right? They're almost certainly doing productive things with their time.
Or like
Yeah.
childcare where they're not going to the grandparents.
Yeah. So again, so if they have this sort of formal childcare, right, they're going to need to pay for that regardless. Like, if their kid's in school, Head Start, they're probably taking their kid to those things anyway for educational purposes. If it's paid childcare that they don't view as educational, they might not take their kids on those days. That's not actually considered like a great thing for the kid, actually. If it's informal childcare, they very likely aren't actually using the informal childcare, right? But remember, that's like a pass the buck volatility, right? Like they're, to the extent that they're now saving on this cost, it's because someone else is now is working a volatile job where they only get paid when they work. Yeah. Is that helpful?
So you think, so again, like you think that they're filling their time with other types of things, but may not as good as the things they could be doing if they had more.
And that's what I mean about like, I'm open to sort of thinking about this as like sort of like a commute type, like, not exactly like free time, but not exactly like employment either. Like you are able to do other things that may give you non-zero. Yeah, or even like if you have like an asynchronous class or something, or like doing homework, right? Like there's things you could be doing for your education. There are things you could be doing for your kid. You could take your kid to the library, right? Like there are also sorts of, parents of young children generally don't have like trouble thinking of things to do with their time. Right. Yeah. So I suspect that they are doing all sorts of things, right? What they have a hard time doing is investing in something that would help them move to another industry or filling this in with other sources of earnings. And they may be paying out for childcare, right, for time that they're not working. Okay. So on average, people are holding open. They're working only 50% of the hours they hold open. The vast majority are working at least 20% of the hours that they hold open. Very few are working 80% of the hours that they hold open, right? So they have this excess time. Okay, this is their actual wage, right? And this is not adjusted for inflation, so these are their 2019 wages. The average is a little over $12 an hour. Only 5% are working like a sub-minimum wage. And in fact, and almost a quarter are earning more than $15 an hour, which, at the time was sort of defined as a living wage. But to be clear, Philadelphia uses the federal minimum. It's one of the preemption states where the state of Pennsylvania doesn't let Philadelphia set a higher minimum wage. Okay. But if you calculate an effective hourly wage per hour held open, right, then it's roughly half, right? And 2/3 of people are actually earning less than the federal minimum for all the hours that they hold open. Basically, no one is making $15 an hour effectively, right? And then if you wanted to think of this as something that was sort of less costly than work, then you might think of like, what would half-time compensation look like or something like that, and you can sort of do those calculations roughly, right? But when we think of all the sort of labor that parents are trying to supply, they're not getting very compensated for that relative to sort of how we think of compensating. Okay. And then how do these weeks vary from each other? Okay, and this sort of gets to this question of like, do people seem to want to work when work becomes available? Right, so there's very large variation observed within individuals in terms of their longest and shortest work week across the month, which I think also gets back to your question, right? So the average maximum number of days worked in a given week is 5.6, right? And the average minimum is 1.5. So the average person in our data has a week when they work less than 2 days, right? That week. So the span, right? The span is like, you work 4 days more on your heaviest week of the month than you do on your lightest week of the month. And as I said before, the majority of our respondents are working each of the 7 days of the week across just this 1 month that we observed, right? And then hours exhibit this negative autocorrelation from week to week, right? So if you're short 1 week, you're more likely to work more the next week. You can think of that as target earning. You can also think of that as like compensatory by bosses, right? If you're the one who was working the day that it rained and they sent you home early, then they try to get you an extra shift the next week, right? To sort of make up for it. They're going to prioritize you for a better schedule the next week, right? But that itself, right, is a main driver of these high hours held open. If you know that some weeks you're not going to get much work, then you need to hold a lot of extra time available so that when they are willing to schedule you, you can take on that time and you can meet your earnings needs for the month. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's a strategy to stabilize monthly income. And we do see people stabilizing their monthly earnings a lot relative to their weekly earnings, but it's at basically a very high time cost, right? So you're sacrificing schedule availability for earning stability. Does that make sense? And that sort of getting to this part is why we're thinking of this the way we are, as something that parents need to hold open. Okay. So now your question, what about a second job? That was your question, right? Okay. Okay. So the classic way to increase hours and earnings in response to what is basically involuntary part-time work, right? The vast majority of these people aren't working 40 hours a week. These people are going to say in surveys, and in fact, the vast majority do say, yes, I would like to work more hours, right? The classic way to do that is to get a second job. And that's sort of the response, when people say like, oh, there's only part-time work available, like, okay, so work 2 jobs. Okay. So here's the problem, right? So this is the first time I've shown you data from job 2. This has all been job 1. These are the start times from midnight to 11 p.m. of these jobs. And job 1 and job 2 have very similar start times, right? And that's basically because these are service jobs. And so most of the work is during the time that customers want to, interface with people, right? And so it's really concentrated. The start times are concentrated in, the early morning hours, sort of before people's 9-to-5 jobs start. There is a little bump in the later hours too, working like a second shift. And there's a bigger bump for job 2, right? So some people are able to find these sort of, starting at 5 p.m., like these evening jobs that they are stacking with jobs where they can sort of count on the fact that those jobs will end earlier in the day, right? If you work at a coffee shop that closes at 3, you are sure that you can make a 5 p.m. restaurant job, right? So you can stack depending on what kind of jobs you get. You can also interweave if you have one of those employers who will give you guaranteed days off, who will respect, I can only work Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, because I have another job where I work Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, right? So you can interweave if you've got two people who will respect that. Right, but that's hard to do, right? These aren't 3-shift factory jobs, right? These are not like this thing runs 24 hours. We're always looking for people to take, swing and graveyard shifts. That's not the kind of job they are. There's just a lot of employer demand for hours that are all at the same time. And then, of course, parenting demands increase this difficulty, right? So another quote, economists can cover their ears. This person was baking for Panera, right? And then working overnight and then having a 9-year-old, it doesn't mesh well. This is from a later survey, so her kid had aged up a little bit. It doesn't mesh well. She's a kid. She needs to go outside. She needs to have activities. She needs to see her mom during the day instead of mom being literally exhausted. And then, I'm like, oh, mom just needs to take a nap. And then a nap turns into, a 3-hour nap. And then she's just sitting there bored. And then at night, she can't even come sleep or snuggle with mom because mom is out at work. That's one that as a parent, like I feel like your kid has a nightmare and you're not there. That's like pretty rough. And remember, like these people like really do have a dual mandate, right? They are supposed to be supporting their kid financially, but they're also, supposed to be supporting their kid like emotionally, right? So it didn't mesh well. She ended up leaving that job for a job that paid less and had less predictable hours, but allowed her to, be home at night, right? Okay. And then, of course, this day of week volatility also makes it difficult to interweave jobs. So the combination of basically all of these issues, right, is that only about 15% of our respondents have a second job at any given time. Actually, a lot like over time have a second job. Like people try to do this. I mean, what you see, people are living below subsistence. They are attempting to get more to survive on, right? And so they try things, but the second jobs tend not to last very long. Okay. So now, okay, right, I'm good. Is that clock correct? Okay, great. Okay, so I have time to do implications, and then I also have time for the non-economists who don't interrupt. Okay. So I want to think about what this means, right? If you guys are willing, you seem willing, you're at least polite about it, willing to think of this work this way, what this sort of means for the types of federal policies that we have and are considering. Okay. So I'm going to divide these federal policies into sort of carrots and sticks, right? So the carrots are these earning supplements that are provided to parents via the tax system, right? So the earned income tax credit, all of our analysis has been for parents who are coupled and single. About 2/3 of parents are single. This now I'm only going to do for single parents because, which is again 2/3 of our sample, because I can't calculate like the full income and therefore eligibility for these things for the married parents. Yeah.
How do you define?
So for these purposes, that's married, right? Because for tax purposes, that's what a tax filing unit is. If you're coupled but living with an unmarried partner, right, then their income is not deemed for tax purposes. So this is going to be relevant to you. I'm happy to talk to you offline about what that means for our SNAP analysis, because nobody is in fact clear on what SNAP work requirements would. Well, I'll actually talk about that in a minute. So let me put a foot in that. Okay. Right now we're talking about taxes. Okay. So for taxes, you're not married. Okay. So the earned income tax credit for single parents phases in at 34% if you have one kid, until it reaches its max at earnings of $11,750. The phase-ins are steeper for 2 and 3 children, and then there's no additional credit for a 4th or higher kid. And the phase-in ends at $16,500. So these are the earnings targets you have to hit in order to get the full EITC that's available, right? For the child tax credit, this is other than 2021. I will talk about the 2021 child tax credit until you beg for mercy offline. So feel free to hit me up. Okay. The child tax credit is $2,000 per child, of which only $1,700 is refundable. And so that's going to be the part that we're really focused on, because basically none of our parents are going to be able to qualify for the additional $300. The phase-in rate is 0 for the first $2,500 in earnings. Above $2,500 in earnings, then it kicks in at 15%. So the one child phase-in ends at about $16,000. And then it just goes up from there. So 2-child is about 29,000, and 3-child is 42,000. And then if you have more children, it's higher in order to get the full amount of the credit. Okay. So many parents do not qualify for the full value of the EITC based on their earnings, but they would if they were compensated for the hours held open, right? If they actually worked all the hours that they hold open for work, over 90% of those with one kid would have qualified for the full EITC compared to 75% who qualify, without the earnings threshold for one kid. Most people in our sample are hitting it because it's pretty low. It's $12,000, right? But more would hit it if we compensated people for all their hours held open. And then for those with 2 or more children, 50% qualify. Remember that the earnings cutoff is the same for 2 and 3+, so that's why there's only one analysis here. So 50% qualify for the full credit, but 90% would qualify if we compensated them for all their hours held open. And remember, the point of the earned income tax credit is to encourage people to supply labor. And so, this is what it would look like if we actually rewarded people based on the labor that they supply. Yeah.
Some of those people actually. It's $7.25 per hour, 3 hours a week.
Yeah.
You're over the top.
Yes, but they would still. So they would still do better because of the CTC. So can I show you the next slide? Okay. So 70% of those with 1 child, right, get the full CTC based on their earnings, but that again would be above 90 if they were compensated for everything. For people with 2 children, less than 1 in 5 is able to get the full CTC, but 75% would be able to get it if they were compensated for all their hours held open. And for those with 3 children, right, it's almost no one can hit that $42,000 earnings threshold, but almost half would if they were compensated for all their hours held open. And I just want to be clear, right, if in order to hit that threshold for 3 kids, you're holding open 70 hours a week on average. So this is a single parent with 3 kids, at least one of whom is under age 8, and they're holding open, half of them are holding open 70 hours a week, right? So, if this is a policy that's supposed to help families who are trying to help themselves, I would define these people as meeting the spirit of that policy, right? Okay. So that's what I have to say about the tax policies. For sticks, right? So sticks are, as opposed to incentivizing people through rewards when they engage in behavior that society, the government would like to see, this is we withhold things when you don't. Yes. Okay. So these are work requirements. Basically, you get this program if you work, and you don't get this program if you don't work. Those there are already pretty strong work requirements for TANF, and that's actually one of the reasons that TANF is a program that doesn't exist in many places anymore, right? Practically speaking. Because if you meet the work requirements, then your income is in fact too high to qualify for the program. Okay. These work requirements also already exist for non-parents in SNAP. So if you're an able-bodied adult without dependents, otherwise known as an ABOD, you have to meet these work requirements in order to get SNAP. There's basically no program that gives any sort of cash or cash-like support to able-bodied adults without dependents in this country without them working. Okay, so when we think about these proposals to add work requirements for SNAP and Medicaid for parents with minor children, right, we have to do some guessing about what that would look like, right? But people's best guess is it would be an individual work requirement within everybody in the SNAP-defined household. And so we're just going to think about for each of our respondents that they would each have to meet that. That works slightly differently for TANF, where they actually will add your hours worked, but that would be sort of impossible to do for SNAP because of the fact that households are defined as anyone sharing meals right? So it sort of needs to be an individual requirement. And that's what people think is how the proposals that haven't been published yet are being drafted. That makes sense. Okay. So if we tried to sort of transpose those ABOD rules onto parents, they would require adults in the household to each work at least 80 hours a month, so which is like a little less than 20 hours a week. It is 20 hours a week in February and non-leap years, and a little less the rest of the time. There's an exemption if you qualify for UI, right? But an important thing to understand is that under normal rules, many hourly service workers, including most of ours, don't qualify for UI if they're laid off because they don't meet the earnings thresholds for UI, right? And then, of course, no one qualifies for UI in this country. In a lot of countries, you do. But in this country, you don't qualify for UI if you leave work for care responsibilities or you're fired for missing too much work due to care responsibilities. Leaving for care is not a qualifying reason, and getting fired for missing too much work for care responsibilities is considered being fired for cause, right? So neither of those make you eligible for UI. So if you don't meet this earnings requirement because you lose your job, you're not going to get an exemption from SNAP work requirements under this rule for the most part for these families, right? Okay. And then an important thing to understand is if you lose benefits due to not meeting work requirements, you have to go without benefits for at least 1 month before you can reapply. And then reapplying is its whole own thing where people face administrative burden challenges with reapplying and actually getting on. So it can, you first have to find a new job, and then you have to get back on. Okay. Make sense? Okay. Okay. So the probability for folks of working at least 1 month with, of spending at least 1 month with 0 hours among people who meet or exceed this 80 hours a month threshold at the annual level. So I don't mean they meet it in the month they work. I mean, they meet it total, like including in the zeros for the months that they don't work, right? So at like an annual level, they're actually meeting the spirit of this work requirement, but because the work requirement is defined at the monthly level and there's this volatility, right? 12% of people who meet it at the annual level would fail to meet it in at least 1 month because of unemployment. And that's even, even among people who are averaging full-time, full-year work across the course of the year, 7% of them are spending at least 1 month unemployed and therefore, missing out, right? And remember, of course, these are people who are actually getting full-time, full-year, but these people, the ones who are working on average 80 plus hours a month, are in fact supplying 48 plus hours a week of work, right? So they're supplying 48 plus hours a week of work, but they're going to get kicked off for the fact that in 1 month they were unemployed. Does that make sense? Okay. And then even among those who are continuously employed across the whole year, right? And remember, like 1/3 of people in these jobs spend at least 1 month unemployed a year, but even among the continuous workers, over 20% of those who meet the requirement on an annual basis fall short of it in at least 1 month. Yes. And that actually doesn't vary a ton across your average monthly work hours because they're so volatile. The people who are managing higher average monthly hours are doing it by working a lot in the times when they are working. It's not like they're somehow managing to avoid the lows. They're just holding open a ton of hours so that they can like work a ton when there's work available. Does that make sense? Okay. And then that's just reminding you that these people are in fact holding open full-time hours, but they're going to get kicked off. When you add the people who experience at least 1 month of unemployment to the people who experience at least one low month, even though they're continually employed, that's about 30% of people who are meeting annualized work requirements who would get kicked off for failing to meet it in at least 1 month. Okay. So the implications for this, right? So there's sort of talking point, right, that people have that most poor families in the US don't have a full-time worker, right? And that framing is sort of, I mean, I think all of us can sort of see what you would assume. So we're like, okay, so the problem of poverty in the United States is that people in these poor families should work more, right? They should be supplying more work and then they wouldn't be poor, right? And that's the fact that's sort of used to justify these carrot and stick policies. Like we need, like people don't face enough incentives to work to get themselves out of poverty, and so we need to give them additional incentives, negative or positive. So, you know, I hope that this research today has raised this question about this common inference based on that fact, which is that parents aren't supplying enough labor. You know, we know that low-income families with children are disproportionately concentrated in service work, which overwhelmingly does not provide full-time, full-year hours. And nonetheless, parents do appear to attempt to maximize earnings. They're accepting overtime, quote unquote. They don't get paid overtime generally, after short weeks, and they're working jobs that involve holding open well above full-time hours available for work, right? And in this context, stick policies penalize even families who do meet the spirit of the rules by failing to recognize endemic work and hours volatility. 30% of those meeting the annualized rules would fall short at least once a year. And carrots fail to reward even families who are supplying extraordinary amounts of labor, 70+ hours a week, while raising children. And I just want to thank its enormous thanks to an enormous number of funders and project staff, without whom this would not have been possible.